Now, when we went to Afghanistan this summer, there were a couple observations we made. I'm going to divide these observations up into two categories. First off, the observations that we made about the way we were doing business, observations looking at ourselves, and then the observations about the Afghans themselves. And you'll notice that none of these observations have anything to do with the Quetta Shura Taliban or the Haqqani network. Good counterinsurgency would make either irrelevant, and neither are terribly the most advanced insurgent groups. With us, though, Churchill once said that the only thing worse than fighting wars with allies is fighting wars without allies. In Iraq and Afghanistan, we've had very different experiences. In Iraq, we had to fight it on our own, but in a lot of ways that was easier than fighting in Afghanistan. And there's been very little unity of effort and unity of command in Afghanistan. So what the Germans are doing in northern Afghanistan may look very different than what the British are doing in Kandahar or Helmand, or what the Americans are doing in Khost or Paktia or Paktika in the east of Afghanistan. The second thing is we have a huge problem with culture. And I'm not talking about Afghan culture, and I'm not talking about Western culture. I'm talking about strategic culture, the way we prefer to do business. Because within military organizations have their own preferred way of doing business, in the same way that we have quirks about our own culture here in America. One of the quirks about us is that we're very resistant to friendly casualties. So we take enormous efforts to reduce our exposure to enemy fire, to reduce our exposure towards casualties. That's normally a good thing if you're doing a peacekeeping mission in Bosnia, but you have to accept a certain degree of risk in counterinsurgency warfare. And this has a lot to do with the third problem, which is our intelligence. I'll go back to the problem of culture after I explain the problem of intelligence. In a normal conflict, in a industrial state-on-state, army-on-army conflict, the things you think about from an intelligence perspective mostly have to do with the enemy's fighting force. You're thinking about size, disposition, composition, most likely course of action, most dangerous course of action, capabilities, these are weapons, these are the things you're thinking about. Counterinsurgency intelligence and counterinsurgency looks a little bit different. It's a lot like conducting social science research in hell. You're in a conflict zone, but you're trying to map social networks. You're trying to think less about, here's a good example. We came to a conclusion, and this is jumping ahead a little bit, we came to the conclusion that the weakness and or predatory nature of the Afghan government was as big a threat to NATO mission success in Afghanistan as was anything that we were doing or failing to do. Okay, what does that mean? Well, that means if I sit down with an intelligence officer in Kandahar province and I say, right, tell me about the Quetta Shura Taliban, tell me about size, disposition, composition, all that great stuff. They can give me great PowerPoint presentations with 5 slides, circles and arrows, fantastic. But if I say, right, tell me about local power brokers, tell me about their ties to the insurgency, tell me about their ties to the government, tell me about who they're related to. Tell me about Ahmed Wali Karzai, the president's half-brother. Who did he have lunch with yesterday? How does he make his money? What are his ties to the insurgency? Oftentimes you get a blank expression. That's not good. And a lot of it has to do with, it goes back towards our culture. If you are doing all your patrolling in armored vehicles in Afghanistan, you're not going to be able to interact with the population. You're not going to be able to get to know who the key figures are in the village in which you're supposed to be interacting. We Americans are guilty of this as much as anybody. We patrol in heavy body armor and with weapons and sunglasses and Kevlar helmets, and then we roll into an area that's allegedly secure and we say, there's nothing to fear here. This area is secure. Let's just all have tea. Well, an Afghan looks at you and he looks at you like you're dressed like RoboCop, and they're not going to buy this. So we have a problem with our own culture and assuming risk. The other problem is we have, this also has to do with culture. If you look at the military, what the military feels most comfortable with is they're a really big hammer, so they look for nails. They look to destroy things. They look to, we're going to protect the population. The way we're going to do that is by killing the enemy. Okay, no. What we try to do in counterinsurgency is we try to think a little bit different. We're not just about killing the enemy, we're also trying to address drivers of conflict. Now, a driver of conflict, the primary driver of conflict in a given area, might well be the enemy. It might well be the foreign fighters infiltrating from Pakistan. But more than likely, it's something like land disputes or irrigation disputes. And addressing those require different tools. So if we get an officer a little bit more smarter than the average bear, he'll say, right, I'm not going to focus on the enemy, I'm going to focus on building schools, mosques, and hospitals because they need social services, right? Okay, that's better. But that, again, that might not have anything to do with what's actually driving the conflict. So maybe you need to devote your effort towards, I don't know, a census or a land registry. This is probably the first time you've ever heard war talked about in this way, devoting these types of resources towards a conflict. But again, when I talk about counterinsurgency, what I'm talking about is a kind of counter-war. The enemy is actually the conflict. If you can address what's driving the conflict, then that gives you time and space, that's a Clausewitzian term, time and space to build up the friendly security forces and local institutions that are necessary for you to withdraw from the country. Now, since we submitted this report, a couple things happened. First off, there were Afghan elections. You may have read about them in the newspaper. They didn't go over very well. There was high levels of corruption. And in a lot of ways, insurgencies, they're competitive governing, or they're governing competitions, rather. And in some ways, the Taliban and the Haqqani network have been very sly about tailoring their efforts in Afghanistan in direct contrast to the Afghan government. For example, they've got ombudsmen on the ground in southern Afghanistan. I love this. So the government, which is widely perceived as being corrupt, and which at the very local level, you see police shaking people down for bribes at checkpoints, and you see all this foreign money coming into Afghanistan, and meanwhile the Karzai family getting rich. The Afghan people see this. But then the Taliban's going around, and you know what the Taliban's doing? The Taliban's saying, right, so you know who our shadow governor is. You know Abdullah, good. How's he doing? Is he all right? You can tell us. If he's a problem, let us know. And so the Taliban is being very smart about the way in which they are listening to the grievances of the people, and they are actually doing that we wish the government would be doing. They've got their own kind of inspector general. This, combined with the McChrystal report, which is pretty dismal, I take the heat on that, I think caused the Obama administration to go back and think about some of the assumptions that they had when they settled on their original policy and strategic goals for Afghanistan. That's not a bad thing. They caught a little heat for that. But anytime you do a strategic planning exercise, you're going to start with a list of planning assumptions, things you think you believe to be true. For instance, I believe we have a credible Afghan partner. Okay, if now you're not sure if that's true, then you need to go back and revise your plan, and that's what the Obama administration did this past fall. And for the most part, most Republicans and Democrats were able to unite behind and say, you know what, this is a good idea, because you don't want to, if, for example, the McChrystal report says we're not going to be successful in Afghanistan without movement against insurgent safe havens in Pakistan, then we don't want to commit 30,000 new troops to Afghanistan without finding out from the CIA, from the State Department, whether or not we're going to have some success in Pakistan. And that led to the president's speech at West Point, which I think overall was pretty good. The one problem is that he had a couple different, and this is going to be the last thing I'll lead with, and then I'll leave with. I'll transition to a quick conclusion. But you had a couple different audiences he had to address with that talk. He had to, on the one hand, talk to the American people, the people of other troop-contributing nations, and the Afghan government. He had to reassure the former that we're not going to stay in Afghanistan forever. And he had to remind the latter that we're not going to stay in Afghanistan forever, so you better get your act together. And then on the other hand, he had to give another message, and that was a message to the Afghans themselves, who were asking to choose sides in this conflict, as well as a message to the Pakistanis and a message to the Taliban, which is to say that, look, our troop levels in Afghanistan are going to go up and down. Our financial investment in Afghanistan is going to go up and down, but our commitment is more or less enduring. I don't think he delivered that message as well as he delivered the first, because I think lost in his, we're going to start withdrawal in 18 months, I think that people interpreted that as we're going, but we're coming, but we're going, which is a little bit unfair. So I'm not sure he sold the message that well.